Okay, we're going to start tonight. This is the second lecture of our year-long lecture series, the StadsSalons lecture series. So I would like to thank everyone who showed up tonight. And we're having, as you know, we're having Professor Yasminah Beebeejaun from the University College of London. We have the pleasure of having her here to give us an exciting lecture on race, the space, and the post-colonial imaginary. My name is Parastu Saberi, and I'm part of the Brussels Center for Urban Studies. And we're a group of us are organizing these lecture series. The flyers are on your tables and around. Do take the flyers and please actually share it with your friends and those who are interested. This is the second series, and we have six lectures coming up, all very exciting. The lecture series have been organized by the Brussels Center for Urban Studies, RHEA, at the UB, and Brussels Academy, and also the migration group at the UB. I'm just going to shortly introduce Professor Yasminah Beebeejaun, and then I would give the mic to her to actually give her presentation. Professor Beebeejaun's academic background is in urban planning from the University of Sheffield in the UK. She's an associate professor currently in the Bartel School of Planning at the University College London. She's also the vice chair of the Urban Affairs Association. Prior to joining UCL, she held lectureships at the University of Manchester and at the University of the West of England in Bristol. She has also been an international visiting scholar at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and University of Illinois Chicago and University of Michigan. Professor Beebeejaun's research focuses on three main themes. First, the way in which representations of race, including national debates about identity, lead to the territorialization of certain spaces as ethnic, and the impact that this has on modes and methods of community participation and ultimately on urban regeneration and city development. She also works on the integration of different forms of knowledge in decision-making and the opportunities that this creates for new ways of engaging with communities. She engages with advocacy and community organizing and investigates the co-production of knowledge with communities. The third theme of her research focuses on an exploration of the creation of inequalities, both within historical and contemporary debates about nationhood, colonialism, and post-colonial society in post-war Britain and North America. All of those issues, of course, for those of you who live in Belgium and live in Brussels, it's very much also the issues, urgent issues here in Belgium and in Brussels particularly to deal with. So we're very happy that tonight we have Professor Yasminah Beebeejaun here. Please welcome her.
Hi, thank you very much for the very generous introduction to my work, and thank you to those of you coming out on a Friday evening, although I understand some of you had to come to this, so hopefully it will be worthwhile and you obviously have an opportunity to have a drink as well. So what I'll say is what I'm going to talk about today I'm going to talk through two seemingly quite different and difficult examples first about how planning has acted to construct race in its own expertise. And I should say that my disciplinary background is in urban planning. We have quite a large faculty at our university of about 40 professors, and only 2 of us actually did our undergraduates in planning. So I'm not quite sure what that says about me, but anyway, so that's very much one of my preoccupations. And I think sort of through my work, one of the things that's been very evident is within mainstream planning debates in Europe and the UK particularly, race is often seen as this really marginal question. When I was doing my PhD, I was asked why I was doing anything on race because it has nothing to do with planning. So by quite an eminent planning scholar. So it's quite interesting, and perhaps that's one of the reasons I've ended up working in the US a bit more, because it is, of course, seen as a very central question in terms of the construction of spaces, even though there are, of course, distinctive differences. So what I want to look at is how the practices around planning are often seen as sort of marginal or not having a limited intersection with important political questions. And I want to argue this evening that race is central to the construction of the discipline of planning, rather than something that is kind of marginal, or maybe, if we have time, that we can address. And it has profound consequences for the discipline, the way that we currently think about race and ethnicity. And the ability, and I guess the limitations of planners and people working within urban planning and placemaking to actually have a thoughtful dialogue with, our increasingly diverse cities. So planning and planners, I will argue, struggle to see difference, but it's integral to the work of planning. But actually the way we even understand difference, I think, also speaks to those limitations. So I would also say planning's engagement has long been seen as problematic. It's not an exceptional policy area, but it does have a very unique role in how spaces and places are managed, and our understandings of them and the visions that we ostensibly co-create. So it has these very real impacts. And the way I'm going to do this is talk about three themes. So firstly, I want to talk about planning's historiographies, focusing very much on the UK and its colonial engagements with the colony of Hong Kong. I then want to talk about some work I've been doing with colleagues at the University of Reading and the University of the West of England, looking at deathscapes and diversity, which comes back to some of the planning questions I looked at when I was doing my my graduate studies a long time ago, and it's kind of interesting but also a bit depressing that we've found some very similar findings in planning around how race and difference is understood. And then I want to draw that all together in the final section. So in talking about planning's historiographies, as I've said, I'm going to talk about work on Hong Kong and planning that I've been doing over the last couple of years, and which is mainly or primarily archival, but also interviews and qualitative research. And I want to say something first to contextualise that within standard accounts of planning, which I think are quite interesting to look at, to think about how the coloniality of knowledge infuses planning history, and that the possibilities that forecloses, I guess, to an engagement that is historically and epistemologically conceives difference. So the work draws on how planning histories are written and how they're framed, and as I've said, I'll talk through some examples of the archival work that I've done, which is both in the National Archives at Kew in London and the Public Records Office in Hong Kong. So, as I said, I work at University College London, which is in Bloomsbury, somewhere you may be aware of. And sitting in one of the meeting rooms one day, I sort of looked up and saw this portrait of Patrick Abercrombie looking at me and wondered what it was doing there. And the rooms had all been renamed after famous planners, most of them white men. The room itself is rather drab. It's not like this very nice location here. It's a basement room with kind of rather cheap furniture where very mundane meetings go on. And I thought, what is it about this room that has required this kind of naming so that we think about Patrick Abercrombie every time we come? And, he has a monocle. I've got a photo of him in a minute that you can look at that sort of makes you feel slightly ill at ease being there. And how does that even relate to what are we saying about planning? And the majority of our students are from outside the UK, more than 60%. So what's it saying to them about notions of expertise? And I was kind of quite alarmed. One of my doctoral students told me that someone had given a presentation that had unironically had a slide saying that the major contributions to planning were white men, and why have no other groups had a contribution to make, which she said was she was a first-year student. One of her greatest regrets was not saying something. She's a very mild-mannered person, but it was also good because I think it stimulated her over the next few years to really engage with some of those questions. And she's just passed her PhD earlier this month, so that's great. But so what is happening here? And I think questions about colonial engagements, decolonisation, and so on are sweeping through kind of urban studies, geography, and related fields. And what I would argue is actually somehow the core of planning somehow has kind of seen it going on, but maybe even retreated a bit from thinking about that. And so planning is a central area of consideration in a lot of work, but it's kind of within the discipline, little is happening. And I think what we're seeing in some ways is a safeguarding and reinscription of some kinds of forms of expertise that don't really want to engage or destabilise what we take expertise to be and who we think are experts as well. So, as I said, in these rooms, it's largely embodied in sort of white male planners. So what do these figurative gestures mean? So, I mean, in the past, a notion of learning about what British planning was would have been on much more stable ground. And I think UCL and other universities have been sort of very involved in, South Africa, etc., in the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, decolonising the curriculum. And this is something that UCL is now saying that it's leading on, which is a kind of, I think, problematic in another kind of way, which we could always talk about later. But we talk about planning history often, or we talk about histories of planning in former colonies, colonial planning. But there's few histories that link those two things together. A notable exception is Robert K. Home, a wonderful writer who has written about sort of British planning and colonialism. And before I say some more about what he's had to say, I just wanted to have a quote from a couple of things, which was, the first is from a standard textbook from an ex-colleague of mine, unfortunately, who's no longer with us, Sir Peter Hall. It says, much of, if not most of what has happened, for good or ill, to the world's cities in the years since World War II can be traced back to the ideas of a few visionaries who lived and wrote long ago. Now, the vast majority of those people, unsurprisingly, turn out to be white men. There's a few women involved in this as well. But it's very interesting to read such a claim, I guess, in more contemporary times. So I could be saying, well, maybe that's like an outdated / classic example, but we can also turn to a more recent example. So from an article this year, so that I read when I was reading about Hong Kong, that was looking at the British rule from the 1840s to 1997. And it says here, the British expatriates described in this paper not only provided Hong Kong with their insights about the city's future, but also established land policies, building codes, urban development and new town visions. Their contribution to Hong Kong's prosperity and stability should never be taken for granted nor eroded by growing Chinese sentiment. And there's a few papers like that, and I think they're very interesting in what they're saying. And like, what I'm not getting into is kind of like which colonies were kind of administered more well than others, but the fundamental idea that we can kind of have this evaluation as just an evaluation of planning rather than colonialism, I think is deeply troubling. So the claims are rather intriguing, and I think that it sort of reflects planning history that we start, when the undergraduate course with, sort of industrial cities to Ebenezer Howard in the UK, particularly we talk about, then we sort of move on to like a series of planners, and then the post-war kind of planning reforms in the welfare state, in a way that's very distant from any other kinds of forms of expansion, particularly colonial expansion. So what I'm interested in, I guess, is about how conceptions of planning or selves or embodied selves as experts are insufficiently challenged within European planning discourse. And obviously I base that particularly within the UK, but obviously it has wider resonances. Simply, there's just too little discussion about these issues within UK's own planning history and colonialism. I think there's just two things I want to highlight without really having a resolution to this. That there's been obviously a lot of critique from the decolonial and post-colonial perspective, which is very welcome and I think very important. But I think sometimes we can move towards a tendency to see colonialism as rather monolithic, and some of the necessary complexity that we maybe need to engage with is lost. And I think it is important to just, there's still a lot more work to be done to examine it. And I think, related to that, the lack of more nuanced and historical accounts is really an issue. And I think more accounts that actually disrupt the narrative. I think, as I hope to show in the Hong Kong example, that maybe when we actually disrupt even what the idea of expertise might mean that's another way of kind of challenging sort of the colonial legacy. So this quote here is from Gominda Bambra, who's a very prominent sociologist in the UK, I think at Warwick. Yeah, so I think where she talks about sociology, it's very related. And she says about how the neglect of colonial relations is surprising in the case of British sociology, given Britain's past as an imperial power, and the fact that decolonisation of British sociology in the post-war context occurred in the context of a legacy of decolonisation and the dissolution of the British Empire. So she talks about a denial of the intimate relationship between sociology and between colonialism, and I think that provides a good link to thinking about planning, a planning narrative that seeks to sort of say that it wasn't really involved in colonialism, or it kind of just did it because it had to be involved, but that's very unreflective in a kind of ethical or more substantive way. And actually much of the development of sort of planning in the UK is about what happened in terms of colonial experimentation and the taking back of certain models to the UK or transferring from the UK to other colonies. And this also includes people that move between these places. So I think there's something important to say. So I have a map which isn't necessarily very good. It's of Hong Kong, so at the bottom. So for those of you that don't know Hong Kong well, there's the island and then the Kowloon Peninsula, and then above that is the New Territories, which was leased to the UK to 1997. So that came into British domination earlier. When I say leased, it was leased for no money. So it was kind of an interesting way of thinking about leasing. I guess like that the reason, and that was because the island didn't have enough kind of resources and water and so on. So when the New Territories lease expired, of course, Hong Kong Island couldn't be kept under British rule, and that's sort of what you know, why there was the handover. And I guess the other thing to note is I mean, the British colony of Hong Kong is a kind of, it's very unique in the sense that it remains colonised through passing back to China as well. So the things that are interesting here is that, so Robert Home, who I mentioned, talks about that this kind of forms of indirect rule provided opportunities for experimentation with progressive ideas, such as municipal improvement and town planning. Yet we have to remember that white supremacist ideas applied to colonial urban landscapes through racial segregation and policy. So it's interesting, I think, as well, just to note how those narratives are often written as very kind of progressive ideas. Sort of, we always talk about post-war planning in the UK as this progressive set of ideas and sentiments, and even in the kind of from Ebenezer Howard onward. But actually, it's a kind of interesting to then link it to sort of colonialism, which of course is incredibly repressive and regressive. So Hong Kong, so I've said this is the boundary is here. Now, it's interesting because accounts of Hong Kong have often sought to downplay the political context and to simplify the colonial narrative. So that in itself is interesting. So it was a British colony from the mid-19th century until its handover to the People's Republic of China in 1997, except a brief period where it was under Japanese occupation in World War II. It's been represented as a relatively untroubled site, with a fond regard for British rule. So when the handover happened, there was all this stuff about how wonderful British rule has been. Now, our concern is not with the relative merits or problems with that historical account, but thinking about how aspects of planning become enrolled in this. So the narrative emerges, and this is a painting from the HKU Polytechnics collection. It's represented as a barren rock with not really much happening. And then in 1997, after British rule for all this time, look how amazing Hong Kong was under the kind of wonderful rulership of the kind British. So I guess I want to sort of problematise that narrative. And I think there's a great book by Carroll, I've forgotten his first name. He gives a very meticulous account. He says the whole idea it was barren rock in itself is very problematic. And actually, as you may know, Hong Kong, expansion into Hong Kong and China was very much about protecting British commercial and merchant interests. So the island was not largely settled, but it would be untrue to say it was a barren rock. and also that sort of this beneficent idea of rule, actually racial ordering was very much in play in Hong Kong. Rule wasn't an unmitigated success. There were key moments of crisis and so on, and there's a lot more work coming out recently. Hong Kong is talked about, or like the Hong Kong Chinese, as very unpolitical, apolitical, but actually there's been a lot looking at many of the political struggles over various things to try and counter these ideas. So I would say the colonial experience is more ambiguous than if we were thinking of other British colonies where we know a lot about the kind of repressive regimes. But as I've said, it doesn't mean there weren't forms of racial discrimination and ordering. So the peak in Hong Kong between 1904 and 1946, non-white residents were not allowed to live there because of a racial zoning ordinance, unless they received special approval from the governor. And I think Anne-Laura Stoller's work is very interesting in thinking about how do we think about actually what's going on in the kind of colonial enterprise in a world where we actually have to think about empires as not monolithic entities or powerful, but more complex sites of contestation, and the need for the colonial officials to try and create rationalities or kind of narratives of rationality in order to try and justify and manage those sites, which may be much more unstable than we think. So in bolstering colonial rule, we benefit we benefit from looking at how the expertise of planning was constructed. So, as I said, after World War II, the British retook Hong Kong and they wanted to reimpose this kind of idea of Britishness. And it was not just in the context of the triumphant allies, but also the resolve to redevelop the urban realm under kind of ideas of rationality and scientific principles of kind of modern, what we would see as the modern planning system. And it's in the archival research, like the Hong Kong colonial officials write, and they say, oh, what are the developments in town planning in Britain at the moment? So they send them like a variety of like documents in the planning bill and say, but adapt for local conditions, whatever that might mean. And so the colonial officials think about this. They think, well, what can we do? And in their correspondence, so this is from the governor of Hong Kong, they talk about how are they going to convince people that actually this is a better form of governance. And it's very much around kind of planning. So they talk about how there's a lot of discussion about who could be the planner to come and sort out Hong Kong, and it's the right kind of chap is needed, is actually a quote from those archives. So they talk about, coming back to Sir Patrick Abercrombie, whether he would be willing to, but it says it would be an advantage if an expert of comparable status could be selected, as his proposals would less likely to be met with opposition from the various interests affected than would recommendations from a comparatively unknown planner. So the necessity of development was there, exacerbated by the war, but also dealing with Chinese housing conditions, and there's work that looks at that and the kind of squatter files and so on, that you know, is much more kind of in depth, and Alan Smart writes about in great detail about that, very interesting work. But the idea here was about the idea, it talks about an opportunity to demonstrate a model progressive community in the Far East. And then the quote continues, the appointment of an expert of standing would be a great assistance in expediting the preparation of a radical plan of improvements. Now, in what happens here, it's very interesting because it's about this kind of reading of expertise. So I think in a way that maybe happens today in terms of planning and consultancy expertise. So that Patrick Abercrombie in this case is going to sail to Hong Kong for 6 weeks, do some work, you know, because obviously planning expertise can just be applied to any situation, and then leave and write his report. And I mean, I don't have time to go into this, but a lot of the file in Q is about talking about where is Hong Kong exactly, what's the weather like, what's the food like, and then complaining about the food and the hotel, and could you pay me some more money, because actually it's a bit more expensive than I thought. So it's kind of, and that's like half the file is about that, not about the actual planning report. And most of the corrections that the officials made were, there were just lots of spelling mistakes of all the place names and so on, and various things. So, you know, this idea here about it's the opportunities given to planners to work within other areas was very beneficial to them, because it also gave them this ability to try and sort of promote their own expertise. Abercrombie, there he is on the left here. He also did plans for various British cities, including Plymouth, so sort of giving his expert opinion here. So they really wanted him to hurry up because he was taking a bit too long to do it. And the reason that they say that is because they say, well, we want to kind of implement some schemes, and we can't do that without a report to justify what we're going to do. So it's very interesting that that's before they've seen the report. And here it's very much about, talking about reflecting colonial interests. So it's a lot around the Admiralty and what they want. And what I argue in the paper that I'm sort of writing around this is the evidence from the archive demonstrates a process that could hardly be talked about as expertise and visionary work. It's very much a kind of idea of like, how can planning be used to bolster sort of the colony? And I think it's very problematic that some of the mainstream planning histories always see planners as sort of, they're just kind of characters of circumstance, that they don't have a kind of ethical stance on this other than perhaps their own self-interest. Now, I'm talking about Patrick Abercrombie. I don't particularly have a problem with him. And I think it's like more kind of, I could have picked any one of a number of examples to do that. So I think the other thing to combat is how, in a moment, I'll just say something about where were all the Hong Kong Chinese people in this? But I think there's a quote here that I think is really interesting about the kind of attitude of the colonial planners. So 2 years later, they're like saying, well, we've kind of rather got carried away with this whole thing called town planning, and we don't have any money to do anything. So we just better do the basic infrastructure and like try and deal with housing conditions because of the refugees coming from mainland China. And they say it would cost a number of millions. The colony cannot afford to do this. Any progress will be very slow in practice. Large-scale planning of a big city, which has been allowed to grow up anyhow, has proven to be impractical. Now, this is written in 1950. This final sentence, I think, is quite stunning. Hitler tried it in Berlin and failed even with his immense resources. So this kind of, it's very, very interesting, sort of what we're seeing in the archives, what people, I guess they never thought anyone would be, bothered to go back and read what they had to say. So I think the archival research reveals that it's kind of a mundane process, not necessarily an expert process, but it's kind of wrapped in a kind of disdain of kind of racial ordering and hierarchy. The Hong Kong Chinese are largely absent here. They appear at the margins. Abercrombie recommends that the Chinese kind of cultural customs are kept going because it would be really nice for tourists to see. And then a very strange assertion that the British are actually much more concerned with Chinese customs and preserving them than the Chinese themselves. So we're also kind of safeguarding cultural practice. I'll come back to some of these issues in a moment, but I think that the kind of main thing I wanted to draw out here are just ideas about actually sort of colonial expertise. It's quite important to just destabilise that itself, to really see it as not expertise, something quite different. So I'm going to move on to something actually different as well, and then hopefully in the last section I should be able to bring two very divergent themes together. So I'm going to come back to the UK, and I guess where I'm making that connection is that we can sort of think about Hong Kong and planning as somewhere happening a very long way away, but I want to think about how that relates to conceptions of ethnic and racial difference in the UK, and more in terms of like Europe as well. So I know the last talk focused on aspects of migration and traces historically, and it was looked like a very authoritative talk. So those of you who are there sort of are very familiar with these. And I want to focus on like what actually happens to people in place, and that the consideration that often when we talk about groups in the UK and other European countries that aren't white, it's always with a sense of like they're not really part of that kind of narrative, and almost, I think, very much in the UK. How did they happen to come here? Rather than actually it's that relationship with colonies and colonialism. And so I think engaging in this case with ethnic and racial minority groups as British is very important, even though their family trajectories may differ from settled communities. And I think I just wanted to just note that I think there are real tensions around this in current discourses about localism, about locality, about heritage and identity, and indigenous forms of knowledge even, which I think that is just the point. And I think the indigenous knowledge debate is very important, but it can be open to appropriation by far-right movements. And there's been some work I was reading about today in Germany, where about kind of ideas of heritage and so on are trying to go back to sort of these very, to the idea of rootedness in place for a very long time, which I think is a very problematic understanding of nationality and identity. So this project, and there's a map here, has just given us an opportunity to look at various issues that the group are all interested in. We've looked at 4 cities in England and Wales. There's a kind of pin there to them, so it's Swindon, Huddersfield, Newport and Northampton. And what we wanted to look at is actually around practices around death and memorialisation. So kind of very things that happen to everyone but are very rarely talked about. And we were very interested about how they are planned for. So they're rooted and dynamic cultural practices, and they're played out at the intersection of the state, local and national, communities, family and religion. So the person that leads this project, Avril Madril, writes a lot about deathscapes, which is very interesting work, and about how they both transgress and represent assumptions of normality and acceptability. And I think it's within an ongoing colonial set of epistemologies. So what we found in the project were that there were really problematic ways in which difference was dealt with. And the reason we looked at towns was because we thought that there would be provision for kind of cemeteries and crematoria in a town in a way that, like, looking at somewhere like London, which is a very big place, would be much more difficult to do. And we were also interested in looking at different groups. So we were interested in established migrants from, like, the new Commonwealth and so on, although obviously there's been a significant black presence since the time of Elizabeth I in the UK, and a presence since Roman times, and also the accession countries to the EU, for all kinds of reasons, as I'm sure you're aware of, like Britain's very troubled relationship with Europe, which is too depressing to talk about quite now. So what we found was that it just reflects a much longer narrative of how humanity engages with what it seems to be thinks of as difference, that really came to prominence during the 70s and 80s, but reflects a very colonial mentality. As I said, this, you know, it's a very kind of glib way of saying it, but actual surprise that people that were not white were coming to live in the UK. And there were basic confusions we found with the different groups of people that lived here. So, for example, not understanding different religious practices. So we talk about this as a duality of thinking. So there's a long-standing narrative in Britain and other countries of a mono-ethnic sort of place, a largely Christian place, although very few people go to church in the UK. And planning's ineffectual adaptation to this diverse society is not just ambivalence, but I think it's also hostility to the ideas of an ethnically diverse country. So UK minority presence exists in tension with a colonial and imperial history that sees people that aren't so-called white British as out of place and needing to adapt to a British way of life, whatever that might be. And the idea of, and this very interesting sort of work that looks at how that manifests within planning, it remains tied to this idea of white ethnic belonging with assumptions that the UK planning process is a correct and neutral way of doing things. And I think there's all kinds of tensions around this, particularly near where I live, with the Orthodox Jewish community and their kind of needs around housing, which is very much always clashed with a kind of aesthetic idea of how housing, Victorian housing essentially, should look. So essentially what happens, which I think is the kind of trap, is that any community that's not seen as white, British, or kind of a normal, is also the word that's used, that they're requiring special treatment in order to be allowed to live in the country. And I think that's a thing that's essential to enabling and facilitating these really problematic dialogues. So we argue that actually in terms of death and so on, that access to death rituals and practices are problematic if we don't live in a cultural context, a societal context, where there's cultural respect and understanding. Now, planning isn't the area where all these things can be resolved, but it plays a significant role that doesn't engage with issues. And like a very kind of an example from our fieldwork was that we went to Swindon and we gave the address for the Hindu temple, and the taxi driver took us to the Sikh temple, which was in a completely different part of town, which we pointed out was not the Hindu temple. And he said, well, no, there's no Hindus living here. You've obviously got very confused about this. And when we met the community who were long established, been there for about 40 years, they were saying this happens all the time. Like people don't, it's like, it's a kind of invisibility, but it's a kind of, it's not, you actually had to cultivate that kind of inability to see, I would say. So also in terms of the UK, these spaces are seen as green spaces, which is very much related to a Victorian aesthetic, which I don't have time to talk about. But we talk about that as a form of a cultural imperialism in a way, because it's not questioned. So there are real kinds of concerns here around death that for Muslim groups, that there are problems in cemeteries because lots of people use those as places for dog walking and allow their dogs to walk over graves and urinate on them, which maybe we would find problematic anyway, but certainly in terms of religion might be very problematic. So the lack of engagement around death revealed to many that thought that they were settled and established communities, that they weren't really, or they were made to feel not part of British culture and British life. There was often an assumption that people would have their remains taken back to the country of origin, even though they'd lived in the UK for 50 years and had British family. So this is a misrecognition, not just of communities, but their needs as specialists. And I think that reinforces existing work that looks at urban space as a space that excludes difference, and it's kind of policed in those kinds of ways. Now, these boundaries may seem kind of insignificant or not noticeable to us, but I think they're kind of there in all kinds of ways, in both invisible and visible ways in which we think about space. So other work I've done sort of with Chinatowns, and it's very interesting that the assumption like every multicultural place has a Chinatown, but that's apparently the way in which we engage with Chinese culture and Chinese people, that maybe, you know, that doesn't really think about the reality of people's lives. And actually some of my students did some very interesting work on London's Chinatown, where it's not, and they're Chinese students, it's not a space that serves a Chinese community. They're all very disappointed by the lack of what they would see as restaurants from different parts of China, and see it as very much a tourist and a white space that has no real relevance to them anymore. So I think those sorts of things are interesting. So, but they reveal something about this inability of planners to recognise differences and diversity of British life. And I'm not saying like, I mean, it is individual planners, but the practice as a whole and the discipline, and that includes academia. So it's about this kind of idea, and I'm going to just show this slide. So this is from here, is just from a cemetery in Huddersfield. You might not be able to see it, but it's also the mix of like how planning doesn't engage with, when we talk about religion, but sacredness. So it's like, it's managed by a local authority. So there's all these signs saying wreaths will be removed from in February if you haven't done so already, and lots of things about like the over management of space as it's just a bureaucratic space. It's got nothing to do with sacredness or spirituality or remembrance or memorialisation of loved ones. And I think that's a kind of interesting sort of finding about there's a kind of cultural difference, and actually sort of belonging is disrespected and not understood in many ways. I'm not going to talk about this slide, and I just want to move on to the post-colonial contestations. So, I mean, those are two very different examples, and I kind of want to try and tie them together because I think they do, though they're very different, they do say things from very different angles about kind of understandings of planning, and the ambivalence between kind of lived realities and state responses to multicultural or multi-ethnic societies. Now, planning has held a rather central position in the UK over these issues in the post-war period, because on the one level we had like a lot of national policy that looked at immigration, that was about citizenship and actually the gradual repealing of rights to citizenship from the new Commonwealth countries and then children, with a real unwillingness to engage with the political dynamics, which were obviously very problematic, particularly in the 1960s when there was like 50s and 60s, where there was a number of high-profile murders, marches, sort of clashes between black communities and the National Front as was. And there was no real direct response to this other than planning and management of urban space was seen as something that should just deal with these issues with no real kind of prescription. There was some funding for education services, and that's the main funding that we saw for Section 11 for the for areas that had children that had spoke English as a second language. Planning finds itself in this curious position where it's not really engaged with difference. It hasn't overtly seen it, even though it's been working in colonial settings, and that many people that worked in British planning in the 1950s and 60s had a kind of colonial background, and many of them came and worked in kind of new town development. And I guess we have sought to distance planning from its colonial practice. But if planning was practiced in the colonies, with planning, as I said, returning to the UK, with little regard for ethnic populations, is it possible to imagine that suddenly there would be a real interest in ethnic difference in the UK? So what does that mean? And I think the language of difference is itself problematic. Now, I know I've been using this all along and sort of talking about race and ethnicity as givens, and I can't remember who says it, but I think it's very interesting because obviously, sort of ideas around race and ethnicity have a long history in kind of empire, coloniality and anthropology, and rather distasteful kinds of ideas of racial hierarchy. And I think there's sort of issues around race. Someone talks about race is a social construction, but it can kill you. So this idea that it's mediated, but it has very real consequences for people as well, I think is something that we really need to engage with. And I think the language of difference is problematic, so the deployment of terms like immigrant, really hate second or third generation immigrant, as well as a kind of terminology that really is always about kind of not partial belonging, not really belonging. Even if it's not meant in that way, I think it can be sort of a deeply damaging language that makes a distinction with white populations who obviously are much more diverse than that, who seem to have a long British history, whatever that means, because obviously British history is very complex and problematic. As well as this, many new Commonwealth immigrants saw themselves as British. So Stuart Hall, the famous cultural studies scholar, famously says about he never realised he was black until he came to Britain because of the racism he faced there. And he talks about the unconscious roots of British racism being the legacy of colonialism. And I think it's that very real tension between the sort of thinking about movement, migration and leaving, I think, and I think the deathscape stuff comes back to that. The idea, well, people are kind of assumed to leave at some point, that they never really feel that they have that presence. And the idea that British citizens some of them trace their heritage to the colonies, creates a tension but needs to be engaged with in much more fruitful ways. Now, I think this is a very classic book, Provincialising Europe. I think it's an excellent book. I know it's been very much critiqued from the Marxist kind of post-colonial term by Chibber recently, but I think there's a lot of value here. And I think Chakrabarty's work does expose a particular Western historiography, and subaltern and post-colonial studies have questioned the way in which European modes of thinking and an imaginary of Europe is inserted into a political modernity. And this quote here from him, a famous quote, that European thought is at once both indispensable and inadequate in helping us think through the experiences of political modernity in non-Western nations. And provincialising Europe becomes the task of exploring how this thought, which is now everyone's body's heritage and which affects us all, may be renewed from and for the margins. So this kind of very significant, substantive challenge about how we understand so what we think of as Western forms of rationality, of which I've included planning as an example, and how modes of planning have sought to impose particular forms of rationality that centralise Europe. And I think sort of what I'm trying to do with a very small contribution is about trying to undermine that idea of British planning as a form of expertise, rather than expertise in a particular historic moment that was given power and strength through colonialism. And that's something that's not really addressed. So strategies of planning and so on, in terms of like other forms of trying to, of control, of colonies have been deracinated from their context, and they re-emerge as kind of sites of innovative planning, in this case that I'm talking about. So we can't think about these things anymore, I think, if we draw on this work seriously, as forms of progressive planning. They just can't be thought about in those ways, but they have to be re-evaluated within narratives of imperialism as locally situated and contingent solutions that may have had, you know, and I think sort of talking about success or failure is also a sort of problematic way of thinking about there. So the notion of reason and rationality, of modernity as the foundation of imperial success demands closer scrutiny, Anne Laura Stoller would say. Rather, when we think about the imperial history of Britain as a racist history and the legacies of colonialism, then we can look at planning anew. The rationalities of planning were very much reliant on a colonial territory as a source of experimentation, but the responses of brutal repression or lack of interest in colonial populations are sort of viewed rather differently within the metropole. And I think, you know, these two images sort of sum up some of these things. So the book cover, which The Empire Strikes Back, so from the Centre of Contemporary Cultural Studies, led originally by Stuart Hall at Birmingham. As a side note, it's very interesting. The work of this group of people is like still incredibly influential, but it says something about UK academia. This centre was closed down for not having enough research excellence. So, but it's one of the centres that few Americans seem to know about. And then on the other hand, this photo from Neil Kenlock, so which I think is, you know, this maybe just to remind us exactly kind of how living in London was in the 70s and 80s and so on, but also there's kind of forms of resistance to that as well. I mean, also we can think about the debates that have been going on in London recently around the Windrush generation, so very important. So yeah, that placard there, the Windrush generation helped to build Britain, and I think again we need to look at those histories, understanding, and I think there's still a lack of understanding of why people came to Britain, what they were doing, but also the incredible contribution they made in terms of building Britain in the post-war period. I mean, some of my family came over during that period to work in the National Health Service and so on, and I think many people made like a significant contribution but faced significant racism in doing that, and including in sort of racism from unions and so on. I think we need to sort of recognise those things in much more meaningful ways. And we have to do those things because I've got two slides here that represent London, because London is an incredibly diverse city. The majority, 45% of the population is white British. So this is a map that kind of charts from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, interesting name for a school itself. So it's got white British, white non-British, black or black British, or Asian British. Now, the pink is black or black British. Now, this is kind of, I haven't got time to talk about it, but racial categorisations are a whole kind of field of their own that you can sort of get into studying because of the fact that Asians as a group are all grouped together and black Africans, there's quite a few countries that are encapsulated in here, and some of my fieldwork has very much come up with the idea that people sort of think Africa's one country, they think everything there that happens is the same, or when I did work outside Birmingham, they tried to consult with Indian and Pakistani populations that had moved there during partition, and they were saying, I don't know why they don't understand that we don't want to be grouped together because there are a lot of tensions between us, but somehow it had kind of gone over their heads. So so this is problematic, but the largest non-white group are black or black British people, but obviously like an amazing diversity of people, but it's very changed from like the new Commonwealth and like majority Indian subcontinent movement, and sort of Christianity, black African Christian churches are opening up. They're the kind of fastest growing religion there. People got very worried about when they said, oh, but London's a majority non-white country, and then they realised that if you added on EU people, it was majority white, and then everyone felt very relieved about that. So it was the only time people were really happy that we had all these Europeans living there. So, and then this other thing is, and you can't see this too well, but I'm sure you'll be able to look at the slides afterwards, which is produced, I think, by CASA, the Centre for Applied Spatial Analysis at UCL, which is looking at religion. One dot is one person. They do lots of really nice kind of graphics that represent, and you can see London isn't sort of massively a segregated city like you might see in Chicago or other US cities, but obviously you can see clusterings of people here. So I think we need to rethink these stories that we're telling ourselves about planning, but it is really important to note that the planning profession remains predominantly white and British, and academia, as you might have seen, that sort of less than 100 professors in the UK are black, out of 19,000, very few. So this idea of like there are kinds of various areas that we need to think about what's really going on here in London, and our own university, UCL, has sort of been really challenged on this because most non-white, if you want to call people that work at the university, are in quite menial jobs. They're not in the academic jobs, and I think that sort of gives a message to the students that we have there. So it's a difficult task to do, and I think what Katherine Rankin talks about is what happens in terms of planning theory. It must not only recover marginalised voices, account for planning's colonialist present history and disrupt imperialist grand narratives. An ethics of accountability demands post-colonial critique, to be sure. Of equal significance politically, an ethics of accountability requires a reflective practice that historicises difference and forges new modes of critical political agency. And I think it's really important, which I think it does involve getting to grips with the categories we're using, the way we engage with people in terms of participation in planning and what we assume. And so in my PhD research, one of my findings was on a survey I did of local authorities around participation was that they had the same policies that they sought to relate to the ethnically diverse communities, whether they consulted with them or not. So, you know, these kinds of imaginaries happen in ways that are very embedded and problematic. Now, it's only through a re-examination of how difference infuses societal processes and challenge them that we can think about sort of what's going on. So I think it's a critical engagement. I sort of use the term of the post-colonial imaginary, but I would say it's about the colonial imaginary, which is still very largely present, and a dialogue with what we imagine post and decolonial critiques to, and that work to open up not just theory, but methodologies and praxis and political agency. So I'm just want to see, oh no, I'm going to come back to this, sorry. So I mean, and this is far beyond what happens in terms of planning, and I think that one of the things I would also strongly argue for is how a narrative's created about places. You know, in order to understand planning in London, in order to understand London, I wouldn't recommend reading the Greater London Plan, which is just being consulted on at the moment, to give you a real sense of what's going on there, or to understand notions of society. And I think one of the things I'm also sort of very interested in is the role of art and literature and so on, to really kind of question in ways that really expose things. And so, you know, very famous painting, J.W.M. Turner's The Slave Ship, as something that was incredibly controversial, but really opened up some forms of dialogue, essentially about how slaves that were ill were cast into the sea because you could get insurance money, which you couldn't get if they arrived in the colonies unwell. So these kinds of very powerful narratives. And also, I think, questioning, we were talking about this earlier, the idea it's all sort of the end of slavery and Wilberforce and so on, that doesn't connect to the agency of people that lived under slavery and brutal repression, the work of C.L.R. James and Black Jacobeans and so on. So those things need to be brought together rather than these kinds of particular narratives of kind of well-meaning or political action. These are two books that are kind of old, The Buddha of Suburbia by Hanif Qureshi and White Teeth by Zadie Smith, but other ways of what does it mean? What does identity mean in an increasingly multi-ethnic and multi-racial society, and what contradictions emerge? And there's lots of different people I could have talked about or put a picture of those books, but those I think are kind of classic and earlier works in terms of the 80s and 90s that deal with that. So I just want to end with so Critique of Black Reason by Mbembe, which I think is a sort of marvellous book, and his work is obviously sort of is just very foundational, very important. And I think, you know, he writes powerfully in this Critique of Black Reason about the dimensions of colonialism that incorporate what he talks about an empirical violence manifested itself most of all in the everyday behaviour of the coloniser towards the colonised. Aggressiveness, racism, disdain, unending rituals of humiliation, homicidal behaviour, what Fanon calls the politics of hate. I think it's a very powerful work there, that actually we need to re-engage with it in all the kind of distasteful and horrible ways in which it's manifested, rather than imagining. And I think sort of work around diversity can be very interesting, but there are some real problems with that language that presumes that through kind of nice processes that we actually challenge a politics of hate that is, you know, embedded throughout how society might be arranged. And it's only through those re-examinations of difference that we think about these things more substantively. So, and Mbembe there says about whatever the location, epoch or context in which they take place, the horizons of such struggles remain the same. How to fully belong in this world that is common to all of us, how to pass from the status of the excluded to the status of the right holder, how to participate in the construction and the distribution of the world. So I kind of want to end with that, and also with this slide. So from Turner's slave ship that I mentioned there to questions around memorialisation, to how we understand the hidden legacies of slavery that mark the UK, the hidden legacies of colonialism that have bolstered colonial expertise, to literature that represents important narratives and stories about the changing nature of society. We still have a lot of work to do to create those narratives. And I put up as a last slide a piece of work from Khadija Soye, who which was exhibited at the Venice Biennale, but also who tragically died in the Grenfell fire, something that says a lot about how race and ethnic diversity and lives in many ways continue to be devalued within London as a post-colonial city. Thank you very much.